My name is Jenna Carver, and everything in my life flipped upside down just a few days ago because of one phone call that changed everything, and it all started with a demand, not a question, not a favor, but a demand from my sister telling me I needed to give her $150,000 from my personal savings, and the way she said it told me it was not up for discussion, because in her eyes it was my duty since I was the one who had a stable job and a good amount of money set aside. And when I told her no, not maybe, not later, just no, she lost it, and I thought that would be the end of it, that she would be mad for a bit then move on, but I was wrong, and I did not even get the full day to process it before another shock hit me harder than the first one, because 2 hours later I got a text from my father, and I stared at it for what felt like forever, because the words in that message made it clear that this was no longer just a disagreement between sisters, it was a full blown declaration, and his message said either I agreed to back her financially or I should not bother coming home again, and those words were like ice because they were not emotional, they were cold and final, like an ultimatum sent from a stranger, not my father. And as I stood there trying to absorb it, something clicked inside me, and I acted not out of spite, but out of something sharper than fear and stronger than anger, and I went into lockdown mode right away, canceling everything she might still have her hands on from the past, and that meant every credit card account she once had access to, every old log in every joint setup, and anything that could connect her to my money or identity. And I spent hours that night scrubbing through account settings and updating passwords and security questions and freezing things I had not looked at in years. And when midnight rolled and my phone started buzzing like it was under attack, with notification after notification lighting up my screen, and in less than an hour I had 37 missed calls and more texts than I could read, and I sat there staring at the phone, knowing in my gut that this was just the beginning and that I had not even seen the real storm yet, because something about all of this felt deeper than money and heavier than a simple request, and there was a part of me that knew there was a truth sitting behind these calls and texts, a truth I had not seen before, and once I found it there would be no unseeing it and no going back to how things were before, and not just for me but for every single person in my family, because this was not just about the money, this was about the roles we had all been forced to play, and how my refusal was the crack in the glass that had held everything together. And by the time the sun came up, my house looked normal and my coffee machine still worked and my car keys were still by the door, but inside me everything had shifted, and I went to work that day like usual, sitting at my desk in my downtown Nashville office, going through emails and planning how many more weeks I had before I could finally move to Toronto. And my savings were the bridge to that plan, the quiet foundation for the next chapter. I had been building brick by brick for years, and I had been careful with that money, choosing not to splurge, not to take extra vacations, not to eat out too much, because every small saving added up, and I treated that balance the way some people treat antique jewelry or rare collectibles, something sacred, something earned. And when my phone buzzed and I saw her name, my heart did not sink right away, because I thought maybe it was something harmless, maybe she wanted to apologize or talk like we used to, and I picked up the call expecting a quick chat about her dream house or something about real estate, because she had been obsessed with finding the perfect home lately, and always talked about big yards and granite counters and a kitchen island, and never once did she talk about the mountain of debt she and her husband were carrying behind that picture perfect life. And over the past months I had trained myself to listen to her dreams without getting pulled into them, without offering to help pay or suggesting I would get involved financially, and that boundary had kept me sane, and I assumed this would be just another call like that, but from the first second I heard her voice I knew this one was different, and there was no casual greeting or small talk. She launched straight into a pitch like she had practiced it in front of a mirror for days, and she painted the picture perfectly. The house had everything she ever wanted, and it was in a top school district for her future kids, and the timing was perfect, and the seller was ready, and the bank had approved them, and everything was falling into place, except they were short by $150,000, and that was where I came in. And the way she said it made my stomach turn, because she did not ask for help, she expected it like it was already hers, and she spoke with a calm confidence that made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable for not offering it before she even asked, and according to her, I would not be losing anything, I would be investing in family, investing in their future, and she even said things like, imagine holidays in this house that you helped make possible, and we will have a guest room just for you, and you will always have a place here, and someday you will be proud to know that you helped raise the next generation in a home filled with love and laughter. And under all those warm phrases I felt something cold and sharp, and it hit me that she was not inviting me into something, she was absorbing me into her plan and making it sound like it had always been part of the story, and in her version of our lives, my savings were just waiting for this exact moment, like they were part of her emergency fund and not mine, and she wrapped that entire speech in this thick blanket of guilt and responsibility, and I sat there holding my phone and staring at the floor, feeling like I was watching my dreams dissolve, and I thought about the nights I stayed late at work, and the weekends I skipped plans to budget better, and the spreadsheet on my computer with my Toronto plans and all the numbers lined up to make my move possible, and I saw everything I had built over the years suddenly treated like a footnote in her story, and I felt something inside me split, and it was like two different voices started talking at once, because part of me was still the girl who always said yes, who always stepped back so others could shine, who was raised to believe that peace was more important than fairness, and the other part of me was the woman who had finally dared to dream of something better, and who had worked for every single penny and every small step toward that future. And one voice said it would be easier to say yes to avoid the drama, to keep the family calm, and tell myself I could recover later, and the other voice said that later never really came, and that every time I gave in, I pushed myself further down the ladder and deeper into a life that was not mine. And sitting there with that phone call echoing in my ears and the fluorescent office lights buzzing above me and my cursor blinking on the half-written email, I realized that this was not about a house and not about a loan. This was about whether I was ready to finally stop being the backup plan for people who had never once offered to be mine. And if I gave in now, it would not stop there, it would only grow, and the next time the number might be bigger or the guilt might be heavier, but the result would be the same, and I would be the net that caught them every single time. And I let that truth settle in, and I felt something inside me harden, and it was not rage or fury, it was something quieter but stronger. It was the moment when clarity arrives and you cannot unsee it, and I finally realized that saying no was not selfish, it was survival. And as the day moved on, the tension in the air felt thick like the weather before a storm, and I knew in my bones that more was coming. And it would not be about bank accounts or loans, it would be about the role I had always played in a family that never really saw me as someone with her own story. And when my phone buzzed again and I saw the name Franklin Carver, I knew the next chapter was about to begin, and I knew what he would say before I even picked up, because he was not the kind of man who left space for disagreement, and in his world authority was the same as love, and rules were more important than empathy, and I braced myself for conversation I knew would not be fair, because fairness was never part of how things worked in our house. I had spent my whole life believing that being flexible was the same thing as being kind, and that sacrificing my needs for my family was how love worked, but that belief started to crack wide open the moment I hung up that call from my sister and saw the name Franklin Carver flash on my phone. Because I knew exactly what that call meant without even answering it. My father had never believed in asking twice or listening to anything that sounded like defiance, and he raised us in a world where questioning his rules meant disrespect, where obedience was dressed up as respect, and where his tone alone could silence a room. And I picked up knowing full well what was coming, and sure enough his voice came down the line with all the weight of a judge delivering a verdict and no space for discussion. And he said that Haley was counting on me, that the family was counting on me, that this was what it meant to be responsible, and that if I was going to throw away that responsibility over money, then maybe I should not show my face around the house again. And the words were delivered so cleanly, so easily, as if cutting me off was just another task to check off a list, and I stood there in dim light of the office parking lot, holding my phone in one hand and my car keys in the other, trying to keep my breath steady, because what hit me harder than his words was the sudden realization that this was not new. It had just become impossible to ignore, and I remembered how many times I had changed my plans to make someone else comfortable, how many weekends I had spent pretending I did not care when my accomplishments were dismissed, how many times I had stepped out of the way so my sister could shine, and it all came back to me like a slideshow of moments that once felt normal but now looked like symptoms of something broken. And when the call with my dad ended, I did not even have time to think before my mother called next. And Diane Carver had always been the softer one, or at least that is what I used to believe, because where my father used authority, my mother used emotion, and her words always came dressed in warmth and coated in layers of guilt. And she had a voice that made things sound like love even when they were manipulation. And as she spoke, I heard the same lines I had grown up hearing, that family means sacrifice, that support is what makes us strong, that I had always been the one she could count on. And I stood there listening to her voice fill my ear like fog, like something soft and thick and hard to see through. And I realized something that hit me like a second blow, that she had never seen me for who I really was, only for what I could give. And she did not want to understand why I said no, because in her mind saying no meant I was abandoning them, and abandonment was the worst sin in our house, and every word she spoke was carefully placed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like the villain in a story I had never written. And she talked about holidays and memories and loyalty as if those things had only one definition, and it was always the one that served them. And by the time she hung up, I was not angry. I was just tired, deeply tired in a way I had never felt before, and I stood by my car in that empty lot and looked up at the sky, and wondered how many times I had let myself believe that love was supposed to hurt, that being part of a family meant giving up parts of yourself until there was nothing left. And the truth of that night settled over me like a heavy coat, and I carried it home with me through traffic, through red light and green lights, through the silence of my car and the static in my mind. And when I pulled into my driveway and walked into the stillness of my house, everything around me looked the same, but I felt like I was walking into a stranger's life, and the walls, the furniture, the kitchen sink, all of it felt like a set built for a person who no longer existed. And I made tea without tasting it, and sat on my couch and stared at the floor and let myself feel all of it, every ounce of betrayal, every thread of pressure, every invisible chain that had been pulling me back for so many years. And the calls had stopped by then, but the damage was still vibrating in my chest, and I thought about every holiday where I was treated like a guest in my own family, and every celebration where Haley was the star and I was the audience, and how it had never mattered that I was steady and careful and kind, because those things were expected of me, not appreciated. And I saw now with painful clarity that my role had never been equal. I was the foundation, the one who held things up, the one who was allowed to break only in private. And I thought about the Christmas when I had brought the gifts for everyone because my parents said money was tight, and then found out later that Haley got a diamond necklace. And I thought about the time I got a job promotion, and my dad said that was nice, but what Haley was doing with her new Etsy store was so brave and so creative. And I remembered all those moments not with anger, but with a sadness that felt like grief, because I had not lost anything that night. I had finally seen the truth of what was never mine to begin with. And I got up from the couch and walked to my desk and turned on my laptop and logged into the credit card account. I barely used the one I had opened years ago and forgotten about, and as the screen loaded, a strange tension gripped my chest, because something in me already knew what I was about to find. And when the page came up and I saw her name listed as an authorized user, I felt the air leave my lungs, and there it was in black and white: Haley Carver had access to this account, and I had not remembered giving it to her, not recently, maybe a long time ago, when she got married or needed to buy something big, and I had meant to remove her later and never did, and that oversight had cost me more than I ever imagined. And I clicked through the recent charges, and each line felt like a punch: spa days, designer home goods restaurant, bills, a weekend getaway to a luxury resort. And not a single charge looked like an emergency or a necessity. It was all indulgence and comfort and ease, and she had done it because she thought I would never look. And Because she had always believed that what was mine could be hers, and the more I looked the clearer it became that the money was not the real betrayal, it was the assumption, the entitlement, the way she had reached into my life without a second thought, and I went through the process of removing her from the account and filing a dispute for the charges, and none of it felt satisfying, it just felt necessary, like stitching up a wound that would leave a scar no matter how carefully it was treated. And then I checked my savings and retirement, and every single account I had, and found more threads she had left behind, old logins, shared settings, recovery emails, all things I had once thought were harmless and convenient, and now realized were cracks in the foundation of my security. And then I opened another account, one I had forgotten about, and saw something that froze me completely under the beneficiary tab, her name again, not as an owner, but as the person who would get the money if something ever happened to me, and I had set that up 5 years ago, when she got married, thinking it was generous and thoughtful, and it was like staring at a mirror from another lifetime, seeing how far I had bent over backwards to take care of someone who saw me as a bank, not a sister, and changing that setting felt like more than clicking a button. It felt like rewriting a story that had defined too much of my life, and as the confirmation email came through, I sat there in silence and felt something shift inside me, not joy, not triumph, but peace, a kind of peace I had never known, and I stayed up most of the night locking things down, updating passwords, erasing old devices from my accounts, setting up new authentication methods, removing anything she could guess, anything she could touch, and each step felt like closing a door that had been left wide open for too long, and by the time the sun rose, I felt like I had put the pieces of myself back together in a way that made sense, and I realized that I had never been this protected before, because I had never expected to need protection from my own blood, and that truth was hard to swallow, but it was also freeing, because now I could see the structure clearly, and when you see something clearly, you can finally decide whether to stay or leave, and I knew I was done staying in a system that only worked when I was silent. By the time the morning light seeped through my living room blinds, I had already been awake for hours, not out of restlessness, but because I had reached a place inside myself where the truth no longer waited for permission to speak, and everything I had learned in the last 24 hours kept echoing louder than any alarm clock. And sitting on my couch with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, I kept thinking about all the ways trust can become a trap when you give it to people who treat it like a tool and not a bond, and I remembered how I used to believe that loyalty meant holding on even when it hurt, even when it cost you, even when the people you loved treated your kindness like a guarantee. And somewhere in that thought, I opened my inbox and saw a message from Morgan Tate, my financial advisor, and the subject line was short but serious, and I knew immediately that she had seen something, and Morgan was the kind of woman who did not panic, but also did not sugarcoat, and her reputation came from being exact, from seeing numbers as patterns and patterns as stories. And if she had something to say, then it meant this had already gone deeper than I imagined, and I clicked the message and watched as pages of data and summary reports opened one after the other, and it was like looking at a mirror someone else was holding up. And the first thing I saw was a credit activity chart with my name tied to multiple financial inquiries, all from the last few months, and they were not mine, and they were not small. They were tied to loan applications in Haley's name, but submitted using information that traced back to me, and the shock of it was less sharp than I expected, maybe because part of me had already started to expect the worst, and the more I read, the clearer the picture became. And this was not one bad choice or one desperate act, it was a pattern, and that pattern told the story of someone who had built her plans around the assumption that I would always catch her fall. And these applications were not casual, they were detailed, thorough, complete, as if Haley had never questioned whether I would say yes, as if my signature was just a formality she could work around. And that assumption cut deeper than any dollar amount. And the next section of Morgan's report showed timelines of recurring missed payments from Haley's household, and how They aligned suspiciously close to the time she had reached out to me with casual comments about being overwhelmed or hints that things were tight, and never once had she told me the full truth. And looking at those dates laid out in neat lines made my stomach turn because I realized I had been subsidizing her recklessness without knowing it, and not with direct payments, but by simply not checking, not questioning, not protecting, and Morgan flagged accounts that should have been private accounts Haley should never have known existed, and yet somehow the trail showed familiarity like someone who had memorized a map she believed would always be open to her, and every transaction, every inquiry, every line told the same story, a story where I was not a sister. I was a resource, and reading that report was like watching a play where I was both the audience and the final act, the person who gets blamed for not saving everyone when she never agreed to play the hero. And Morgan ended the report with a projection, and it listed what would happen to me if I gave Haley what she wanted. And at the top of the list was the phrase delayed relocation to Toronto, followed by reduced emergency saving, increased financial vulnerability, and a projected timeline that would push my career back by years. And looking at those outcomes, something snapped into place. And I finally saw the whole picture, not just the surface, not just the emotions, but the reality. And the reality was this: if I gave in, I would not be saving my sister, I would be signing myself into a life where I was always second, where my dreams only moved forward when hers allowed it. And I sat there staring at the screen and felt a cold calm settle in my chest, the kind that comes not from rage but from recognition. And I realized that what I was experiencing was not a disagreement, it was a moment of survival, and that saying no was not just the right thing, it was the only thing. And by the time I looked at the clock, half the morning had vanished, but I had never felt more awake, and I packed up my things for work, but every step felt heavier because I knew now that I could never unsee what I had seen. And when I walked into the office and sat down at my desk, it was like watching two versions of my life split in front of me, the one I had lived up until now, and the one I was about to choose. And I tried to focus on work, on email, on schedules, but my mind kept drifting, and somewhere between meetings my phone buzzed again. And this time it was not Haley, it was Franklin Carver, and seeing his name on the screen made my breath catch, not from fear, but from memory, the memory of how many times I had folded myself in half just to keep his version of the family intact. And his message was short and sharp, a reminder that in his world I was still the one expected to fall in line, and that refusing to help Haley was not just selfish, it was betrayal. And the way he said it was not angry, it was factual, like he was correcting a child. And I stared at the screen and felt something ancient rise in my throat, not tears, not pain, but exhaustion, the kind that builds over decades of being the one who gives and gives and gives, until there is nothing left to give. And almost immediately after came the second notification. Diane Carver, and her message was wrapped in warmth, but the kind of warmth that burns if you get too close. And she said she was worried, said she missed me, said this was not like me to be so cold and unkind, and she asked if I had forgotten what family meant. And I sat there reading her words and feeling the old pull to explain, to soften, to take back the power I had just claimed. And in the past I might have done that, I might have called and cried and apologized for making things difficult, but not this time, because now I understood that every time I compromised, it taught them to expect that I would, and every time I stayed silent, it told them my needs did not matter. And I could see the full pattern now, and it was a system built not on love but on control. And I left work early that day because my chest felt too tight and my thoughts too loud, and I drove without a destination, just to move, just to breathe. And I thought about every time I had been left out or minimized or told to be the bigger person. And none of those moments were accidents, they were bricks in a structure designed to keep me useful but never free. And I realized then that this was not about a house or a mortgage or even $150,000. It was about a system that had used me as its foundation for years, and my refusal to fund Haley was not a crack in the wall, it was an earthquake. And that was what they were fighting now, not the loss of money but the loss of control. And when I pulled into my driveway turned off the engine, the silence felt like the first real silence in days, and I walked into the house and did not hesitate and opened the drawer where I kept my travel folder, the one labeled Toronto, and I took out every document, every plan, every flight I had bookmarked, and I opened my laptop and I booked the one-way ticket, not a round trip, not a maybe, just one direction forward, and my hands trembled as I typed, but not from fear, from something else, from the strange sensation of choosing myself for the first time without apology. And when the confirmation page appeared, I closed my eyes and let the weight of it settle in, and I was not thinking about who I would disappoint, or who would call next, or what names they would throw at me. I was thinking about the version of myself I had buried under years of being the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who never said no, and I was finally digging her out, not with a shovel, but with a decision, and that decision was not up for debate. And it was not revenge, it was release, and I was not leaving to hurt them, I was leaving because I could not heal in the place that taught me to bleed quietly. After booking that one-way ticket, something inside me finally quieted, but it was not the kind of quiet that comes with peace or sleep. It was the kind that comes after a storm, when everything is still standing, but nothing looks the same, and I sat there on my bed, surrounded by the soft hum of electronics and the pale light from my desk lamp, and it all felt surreal, as if I had just stepped out of my own skin and was now watching my life unfold from the outside, and I could still feel the weight of that confirmation email settling in my chest, heavier than I expected, but also strangely grounding. And I thought about all the versions of myself that had led me here, the child who learned to stay small, the teenager who never asked for too much, the adult who was always one step ahead in case someone else slipped. And I realized I was not running away from my family. I was finally walking away from the story they had written for me, and the next day came faster than I was ready for, and I walked into work like I always did, past the front desk, through the hallway that smelled like fresh printer ink and recycled air, and into the lab where everything felt controlled and familiar, but even there the air felt different, and I knew it was not the place that had changed, it was me. And I tried to pretend that everything was normal, that I could go through emails and updates without my mind spinning, but my body betrayed me with a restless energy that made it impossible to sit still, and by the time I made it to lunch I could barely hold a conversation, and when I finally sat alone in the break room, the silence around me wrapped itself around my shoulders like a blanket I did not ask for, and I held my coffee cup tight between both hands, not because I was cold, but because I needed something to ground me. And then I opened my phone and checked the notifications again, and nothing new had come through yet, but I could feel it coming, the way you feel thunder before you hear it. And I stared at my screen until a new email finally landed in my inbox, and it was from the last person I expected at that moment, Morgan Tate again, and my fingers paused just above the screen before tapping it open, because after everything she had already sent, I was not sure how much more I could take. But when I read her latest update, I felt something crack all over again, not from shock, but from confirmation, because the first few lines explained that she had continued checking and had pulled additional credit alerts and financial activity, and what she found tied everything together like a thread pulled tight across every corner of my life. And the report was longer than before, more detailed, more brutal, and she included charts and comparisons and trend lines that made the truth impossible to deny. And what it showed was not one incident, not two, not even three, but a long-term pattern of behavior that had been building for years, slowly, quietly, hidden behind birthdays and holidays and polite check-ins. And I scrolled past the summary and into the details, and saw a long list of unpaid balances, missed payments, and refinanced accounts, all tied to Haley and her household. And the way they had managed their finances was not just irresponsible, it was destructive, and built entirely on the assumption that someone would always step in when things got too bad, and that someone had always been me, and I did not even know it, because so many of these decisions were made without my knowledge, but with enough overlap in addresses and shared accounts from years ago that they left fingerprints all over my records. And there were credit cards opened in joint names back when I thought helping her would be temporary, and those cards had never been closed, and now they were maxed out and drowning. And she had never told me, not once, and what hurt most was not the money, it was entitlement, the belief that I would never find out, or that if I did I would forgive it like I always had, and I kept reading through line after line, and saw transactions from accounts I had not used in years, accounts I had even forgotten existed, but she had not forgotten, and she had found ways to use them, sometimes small, sometimes large, always confident, always silent. And it was not just Haley who was part of this pattern, it was the system. We had grown up in a system that had taught her that someone would always carry her, that consequences were optional if you had someone more stable nearby. And Morgan's final section was what made everything stop, because she included projections again and laid out scenarios that would unfold depending on my choices. And in every single version where I gave her the money, my future crumbled not instantly, but slowly, like a structure eaten from the inside. Delayed goals, lost savings, reduced credit opportunities, and a ripple effect that would make even small emergencies into impossible obstacles. And seeing my life laid out like that in bullet points and predictions made something inside me snap into place. And it was not anger, not fear, just understanding. And I sat there in that break room and felt the hum of the refrigerator and the buzz of the lights, and knew that nothing would ever go back to how it was before, and that I did not want it to. And the truth was this: I had spent so many years believing that helping my family made me good and selfless and worthy, but what I had been doing was trading pieces of my life for silence and approval. And Morgan had given me the clearest gift anyone could have given. She showed me that I was not just giving money, I was giving away years and plans and freedom. And in that moment, I finally believed that walking away was not failure, it was protection. And by the time I left work, the sky had started to darken, and I drove home with the windows down, letting the air hit my face, letting the city blur past me. And I thought about how many times I had been called dramatic or ungrateful, setting boundaries, and how often I had been told that family comes first, as if that meant I always had to come last. And the memories came in waves: the birthdays where I paid for everyone and no one offered to split the bill, the calls from my parents when Haley needed help again, the quiet way my achievements were always second to her struggles, and the way every single person in that house had learned to say thank you without ever meaning it. And I knew that the message I would get next would be the one that pushed everything over the edge. And I was not wrong, because as I stepped into my house and set down my bag and checked my phone, I saw a new message from Franklin, and I opened it knowing exactly what kind of language he would use. And he did not disappoint, because his words were not emotional, they were directive. He said he was disappointed. He said I had forgotten who I was. He said Haley needed support and I was being cruel for withholding it, and the way he said it made it sound like he had given me everything and now I owed it back. And I read that message 3 times, and each time it made me feel less like a daughter and more like a soldier being reprimanded for disobeying an order. And not even 5 minutes later, another message came through, this time from Diane, and her words were wrapped in soft concern, but the kind that hides a blade. And she said she hoped I would come to my senses, that family meant everything, and that she missed me, and hoped I would not do something I would regret. And I looked at her words and saw the same pattern again, guilt dressed up like care, control masked as concern. And I stared at those messages, and I did not reply, and I sat in that silence and finally let it speak for me. And I made myself dinner and ate it alone, and watched something on television without hearing it, and I felt the freedom that comes with no one needing anything from me, and it felt unfamiliar but right. And I spent the rest of the night going over every plan for Toronto, organizing paperwork, making checklists, updating contacts, and for the first time in years my future felt like it belonged only to me. The morning after I made my decision to leave felt different, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady way that follows a final choice, the kind you cannot take back, and would not want to. And I woke up before the alarm even went off, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dim half-light of dawn, feeling something that almost resembled peace, but was still too raw to be called that. And it was the first time in years that I did not feel like my day belonged to someone else. And I moved through my house like I was saying goodbye to it, not because I was leaving tomorrow, but because I had already detached in my heart, and even the smallest things like the coffee machine humming or the creak in the floor by the hallway felt like parts of a life that had served me but could not hold me anymore. And I thought about how long I had been building that life, the job, the apartment, the careful budgeting, all done with the hope that one day I would reach a place where I could finally breathe without someone else's needs pressing against my ribs. And yet even in that careful structure I had still been carrying the weight of a family that saw my stability not as a victory but as a safety net for their recklessness. And I sat on the couch sipping coffee and scrolling through more updates from Morgan, who had sent one final batch of documentation to make sure everything was closed and locked and unreachable to anyone but me, and she had gone above and beyond flagging risks I had not even considered, like old tax files that had been shared for FAFSA applications or a retirement account I'd started and forgotten during my first job after college. And seeing her list of action items made me realize just how wide the cracks had spread in my financial boundaries, and how little I had protected myself because I had always assumed the threat would come from outside, not from within. And I followed her checklist line by line, closing what needed to be closed, changing names, updating beneficiaries, removing access. And by the time I finished the last task, I felt like I had pulled every last thread of Haley out of the fabric of my financial life, and it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a decade. And then I did something I had been avoiding for days. I opened my old shared family photo folder, the one we all contributed to over the years, and I scrolled through birthdays and Christmas mornings and blurry Thanksgiving dinners, and I watched myself in those pictures slowly disappear, not physically but emotionally. And in every image I was there but not present, smiling but hollow, helping but never being helped. And I remembered how many times I had planned those events, or paid for them, or stayed up late baking or cleaning or organizing, and how those things were always expected, never acknowledged. And I remembered the look on my mother's face when I bought Haley a bridal shower gift that cost more than my monthly groceries, and how she called me thoughtful and generous, like it was an identity I should be proud to die inside for. And I closed the folder and deleted it, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed proof of how much I had given and how little they had seen me. And later that day, while I was packing, another message arrived, this time from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakable. It was Haley, and her message was short and sharp. No hello, no apology, just a sentence that hit harder than a paragraph. She said, "I hope you can live with yourself after what you've done." And I stared at that message for a long time, and then I put down my phone and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly her, and it said everything she had not dared to say out loud for years, that in her mind everything I had was hers by proximity, and my refusal to give it made me selfish, not safe. And I did not reply, and I would not, because I had already learned that you cannot argue with people who believe your boundaries are a betrayal. And as the hours passed I kept packing, and the more I packed the lighter I felt, and each item that went into a box felt like a piece of myself being collected from a battlefield. And I kept my essentials close and let go of the rest, because I was not trying to carry the past into my future. And somewhere around evening I got a second message, this one from Diane, and it said she had heard I was leaving, and that she was heartbroken, and that family is not supposed to fall apart over money. I read that one too, and felt the ache in my stomach, not because it hurt, but because it was so predictable. And I knew that to her this was about a number, about a transfer, about a single choice. But to me it was about years of being erased and used and reshaped into a role that no longer fit. And I did not reply to that one either, because I was no longer in the business of defending my right to peace. And I spent the night doing something I had not done in a very long time. I sat on the floor of my living room and I dreamed about the life I would build in Toronto, about the early mornings and the subway rides and the feeling of walking into a room where no one knew me as the fixer, the backup, the quiet one who always said yes. And I dreamed about going to the market on Saturdays and sitting alone in cafes with a book and not worrying about anyone calling me in crisis, telling me I owed them because I had more. And I knew those dreams were still fragile, but they were mine, and that was enough. And the next morning I woke up and checked my bank accounts one last time, not out of fear, but out of certainty, and everything was clean, every account secured, every detail corrected, and I knew without a doubt that the past could no longer reach into my future, and I dressed simply and packed the last bag and looked around the house one more time, and I did not cry because I had already grieved this place the moment I bought that ticket and I left the keys on counter and walked out the door without looking back, and the airport was busy and loud and full of motion, and for once I felt like I belonged to that chaos because I was moving too, and I stood in line at security with strangers who knew nothing about me, and it felt like freedom. And when I finally boarded the plane and found my seat, I sat down and closed my eyes and let the sound of engines and murmured conversations wash over me, and when the wheels lifted off the ground, I did not flinch, I did not clutch the armrests, I just breathed, and in that breath was everything I had lost and everything I was about to find, and the city below grew smaller and smaller until it was gone, and I did not miss it, not the way people expect you to miss home, because my home had never really been mine, and now I was flying towards something that was not built on guilt or sacrifice, and when the plane touched down hours later in Toronto, I stepped off with nothing but 2 suitcases and a heart full of space, and I was not afraid of starting over because I was not starting over, I was finally starting for real. Moving into a small rental apartment in Oak Park felt nothing like starting over and everything like finally starting, and the first night I slept on a mattress without a frame with 2 suitcases stacked like makeshift drawers and boxes still taped shut around the room, but I had never felt more stable, and the quiet was not the eerie kind that follows a fight. It was the kind that follows freedom, and the silence was honest and soft. And when I looked around and saw my things in a place where no one had ever stepped in to claim authority or make demands, I understood that this was the first space I had ever occupied that belonged only to me, and I spent the next day unpacking slowly, methodically, like someone settling into the idea that they were finally allowed to be comfortable, and I made lists of groceries and found the nearest laundromat and opened a new bank account at a branch that had no connection to my past, and every single task, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been waiting to surface. And I remember standing in front of the mirror that evening, brushing my hair with the window cracked open and the sound of traffic floating in, and realizing that I was not waiting for my phone to buzz anymore, and not waiting for another crisis or another apology that was really a warning in disguise, and I was not watching for their names to flash across the screen, and that stillness was not absence, it was peace, and it took me a few days to settle into the rhythm of my new job, but the pace of work at the research lab was exactly what I needed: focused, structured, clean, and no one there expected me to bend to fit a version of myself that made their lives easier, and my manager asked direct questions and gave direct praise, and for first time in my professional life, I did not feel like I was waiting to be resented for succeeding, and I would walk into the building each morning with a cup of coffee and headphones in, and a quiet that lived inside me now, and every day I sat at my desk and remembered how long it had taken to get here, how many detours I had made for people who never intended to take a single step for me, and I no longer measured time in weeks or deadlines. I measured it in distance from the last time I said yes when I meant no, and sometimes when I opened my laptop at night to review reports I would get an alert from one of the old credit tracking apps, and at first I hesitated, but then I realized I needed to see what was unraveling on the other side, not for revenge, but for understanding, and that is how I found out what had happened to Haley, and it came in the form of a credit drop notification, that traced back to the joint account I had forgotten to disable from alerts, and I clicked through and saw her score had plummeted not by a little, but by a lot, and the report attached showed late payments, default notices, and a maxed out balance with no safety net to catch her anymore, and I stared at that screen and waited for some emotion to arrive: anger, satisfaction, guilt, but none of it came, because what I felt was clarity. She had not expected consequences, not real ones, and she had believed until the last moment that I would give in, and the weight of her choices now sat fully on her shoulders. And what followed were more alerts over the next few weeks: a denied mortgage, a new collections agency, a frozen application for another credit line, and each one felt like a piece of a tower collapsing, one that had been built on my silence for years. And then one day another name popped up in a local article from Maple Glen, and it was Franklin, and the story was not dramatic, just a community bulletin that mentioned a rumor about financial misconduct. And while nothing was confirmed, the damage was already done, because in towns like that rumors are currency, and his image had always been his power, and once that image cracked there was no repairing it. And I did not call to confirm, and I did not need to, because I knew exactly how that would unravel. I knew he would try to fix it with authority, and then with charm, and then with shame, and when none of that worked he would fall silent, and that silence would be heavier than any punishment I could ever deliver. And Diane's name came up again too, this time in a group message I had muted and forgotten to leave, and her tone had shifted, not panicked, not aggressive, but uncertain, like someone who had walked into a room and found that all the furniture had moved. And she wrote that she missed me and hoped I was okay, and asked if I would consider coming back for the holidays. And I read that message twice and did not reply, because I had nothing left to give, not even a response. And that night I sat at my kitchen counter and ate dinner in quiet, and it was not loneliness, it was liberation. And I realized that I no longer needed them to understand, because I had stopped trying to explain, and explaining had never worked anyway, because people who benefit from your silence will never hear your words. And the most surprising part of all was how normal life became once the weight of them was gone, and I started going to the gym again, and picked up an old hobby, painting, which I had not done since college, and I made friends slowly, intentionally. And when people asked about my family, I said I did not really keep in touch, and then changed the subject, and no one pushed. And I realized how rare that was, to be allowed to protect your own story, and I did not think about them every day, just on certain nights when the wind reminded me of Tennessee, or when I saw a family eating together at a restaurant, and for a second wondered what it would have felt like to belong. And then I remembered that I never had, and I let the moment pass like a leaf in water. And a few months after I moved, I received one final letter, and it came from a law office connected to the Carver name, and the envelope was thick but not legal in the threatening sense. It was desperate, and I opened it and read the carefully typed pages, and saw what I had expected. It was not a lawsuit. It was a plea, a request for mediation, for reconciliation, for financial discussion. And I folded the papers and put them in a drawer and never opened them again, because closure does not always come from conversations. Sometimes it comes from walking away and refusing to turn around. And the funny thing was that once I stopped reacting, they stopped reaching, and what remained was silence, and that silence became my home. There was something about the silence that followed their final attempts to pull me back that felt more permanent than any argument or accusation, and I knew without needing to be told that they had realized I was gone, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and that understanding on their part, even if they never said it out loud, gave me the final piece of peace I needed to keep building my new life without looking over my shoulder. And in the weeks that followed, my world began to reshape itself in small, steady ways. I found a coffee shop near the lab that made their lattes just the way I liked them, strong and smooth, and served without the forced cheer that always felt hollow. I walked to work most mornings when the weather allowed it, and used that time to breathe deeply, to watch the changing leaves, or the wet sidewalks, or the way the city moved around me without asking anything from me. And it was the first time in my adult life where I was not being pulled in 10 different directions, and I finally had space to think, and that thinking led me to places I had avoided for years, like who I was outside the roles my family had assigned to me, and what I wanted in a future that was no longer tied to proving my worth to people who had decided long ago that I existed to serve their comfort. And I started going to a small bookstore every Thursday night, where they hosted quiet reading hours, and sometimes I would talk to the owner, who was older and kind, and never once asked me why I came alone. And I loved that about him, because it made me feel normal and whole. And the walls of my apartment started to fill up with color, not from expensive things, but from moments that meant something, like a postcard from a coworker who thanked me for helping her finish a project, or a plant I bought on a whim and managed to keep alive, or a painting I started one night when it was raining and finished by sunrise. And each one felt like a marker on the map of my new beginning. And even though the past did not vanish, I found that it no longer held me hostage. And sometimes I would lie in bed and think about all the times I had been expected to save people from their own decisions, and how none of them had ever thought to ask what I needed, or who I was beneath the calm, the readiness, the solution, and I realized that for most of my life I had not been a person. In their eyes I had been a function of fallback, and now that I had taken that role away, they did not know how to see me, and that truth no longer broke me, it freed me, and I kept getting updates from Morgan, who remained sharp and protective, and never once asked if I regretted anything, and her silence on that matter was her way of saying, I made the right call, and she helped me build new layers of security, digital and financial and emotional, and I followed every step because protecting myself was no longer optional, it was a non-negotiable requirement for the life I was finally claiming as mine. And during one of our last calls, she said something that stayed with me. She said people think boundaries are about keeping others out, but really they are about keeping yourself safe inside. And I wrote that down and put it on my fridge because I wanted to see it every day and remind myself that I had not shut them out, I had kept myself in, and that choice had saved my life. And months passed, and the seasons changed, and the rhythm of my days became something I could trust, and I started sleeping through the night, not every night, but more than before, and I stopped flinching when my phone rang. Because the people calling me now were not demanding, they were offering conversations, laughter, plans, and I started to believe that maybe the universe had been waiting for me to clear space so it could give me something better. And one night while walking home, I passed a family gathered around a dinner table visible through a window, their laughter spilling into the street, and for a split second I felt a pang not of jealousy, but of longing for something I never truly had, and I let myself feel it, because denying it would not erase it. And then I kept walking because I knew that what I was building was real and not wrapped in performance or pressure, and I would rather be alone in truth than surrounded in lies. And around that time I was asked to give a talk at a local university about my work at the lab, and when I stood in front of that room full of students and shared my research, I saw in their eyes a kind of respect that was rooted in what I had done, not what I could do for them, and that felt new and beautiful. And I left that lecture hall with a smile that reached deeper than I expected. And on the walk back, I thought about how far I had come, not just in distance, but in understanding, and I knew that I was no longer afraid of being alone, because I was not lonely, I was sovereign. And there is a difference, a huge one. And the truth is, I thought I would feel guilty forever for choosing myself, but what I learned is that guilt fades when you stop feeding it, and what grows in its place is a kind of quiet power, and that power showed up in the way I no longer explained my choices to people who only wanted to argue, or in the way I said no without hesitation, or in the way I stopped apologizing for things that were never mine to carry, and I even started writing again, not for work but for me, and I filled pages with thoughts, memories, dreams, ideas, and none of it was edited or polished, and all of it was mine, and I did not care if anyone ever read it, and I think that was the point, because so much of my life had been lived for the audience of others, and now I was finally living for myself, and that realization settled into me like warmth. And one morning, I opened my inbox and found an email from a name I almost did not recognize. It was someone from back home, a neighbor who used to live down the street, and she wrote to say that she had heard what happened with my family, and she just wanted to say she admired me and hoped I was okay. And I stared at that message and felt something inside me soften, not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me that sometimes the truth finds its way into the world even when you do not tell it, and that was enough. And I replied with a thank you and closed my laptop and went back to living my life on my terms, with my rules, in a space that echoed only with my own voice, and that was the kind of peace no one could take away from me ever again. It was strange how quickly a life could transform when you stopped offering it to people who only saw your worth in what you could do for them. And in the weeks after that neighbor's message, I began to feel the full shape of what I had done, not just the distance I had created from my family, but the closeness I was now building with myself. And I had never realized how much of my daily energy had been spent anticipating their moods, their expectations, their demands, until all of it stopped, and suddenly there was space for other things, and I filled that space slowly, intentionally, with routines that made me feel grounded, like taking long walks every evening, no destination, just moving through the world without being hunted by obligation. and on one of those walks I passed by a small art gallery with a sign that read Local Showcase Submissions Welcome, and something in me paused and stared at it for a long time, and when I got home I opened my old sketchbook and flipped through the pages covered in half-finished drawings, smudged lines, ideas I had never allowed myself to finish because there had always been something more urgent, someone more urgent, and I picked up a pencil and began to draw, not with pressure or expectation, but with curiosity, and it felt like finding an old friend who still remembered my name. And for the next few nights I kept going back to that sketchbook, and the pages filled slowly, and then faster, and I brought a few of them to the gallery, and the owner smiled and said they were honest, and that was the best compliment I had ever received for something I made. And a week later one of my pieces was hanging in the window, and people walked by it without knowing who I was or what I had been through, and I loved that because it meant they were seeing the work and not the history, and that was all I had ever wanted, to be seen without being dissected. And I remember calling Morgan just to thank her again, not for the numbers or the spreadsheets, but for standing by me in the moment. I almost gave up my future to preserve someone else's, and she laughed and said I had done the hard part, and I told her that the hard part was not walking away, the hard part was believing I was allowed to, and that belief was what kept me going, because the truth was I still had moments when the past tried to crawl back into my chest like shadows sneaking under a door, and I would hear a song or see a familiar brand of wine or overhear a conversation that reminded me of Diane's voice or Franklin's lectures or Haley's laughter when she got what she wanted, and those moments did not break me anymore, but they did make me pause, and I let them, and then I moved forward again. Because healing was not a straight line, it was a spiral that kept bringing you back to the same place with a new level of strength, and I had finally stopped mistaking that spiral for failure, and that shift changed everything. And one afternoon, while I was organizing digital files on my laptop, I found an old document labeled Family Budget 2012, and I opened it out of habit and saw rows of expenses that I had helped cover that year back when Haley had her first financial scare. And I saw my own name listed next to payments for her rent, her utilities, her textbooks, and not once had I asked to be paid back, and not once had she offered. And I stared at those lines and realized I had been trained to feel proud of that, to believe that giving without being asked was love, and that being the dependable one was a badge of honor. But now I saw it for what it was, a survival strategy that had been mistaken for virtue, and I closed the file and deleted it and emptied the trash without hesitation. And later that night I walked through the city while it rained, the kind of rain that soaks through your clothes and makes you feel alive, and I ended up at a diner and ordered a slice of pie and a cup of coffee and watched people come and go, and no one there knew me or what I had escaped, and that anonymity felt sacred. And I thought about how far I had come, not just from Maple Glen, but from the version of myself that would have returned a call just to keep the peace. And in that moment, I promised myself I would never again sacrifice my future for someone else's comfort, and I meant it. And a few days later, I got a call from a number I almost blocked on instinct, but curiosity won, and I answered, and it was someone from the financial aid office at my old university calling to let me know that Haley had used my name as a reference for a new application, and they were calling to verify details, and my chest tightened for half a second before I told them calmly that I had no involvement, and requested my name be removed from any further communication. And the woman on the other end apologized and said it would be taken care of, and I hung up and sat in silence and waited for the old fear to return. But it did not, because this time I had not bent, I had not compromised, and that single moment felt like a test I had passed. And the next time I saw an alert from that old joint account, it was to notify me that it had been closed by the bank due to inactivity and debt, and I felt nothing but relief. And I started keeping a journal where I wrote one sentence every night. Sometimes it was about the weather, sometimes it was about work, sometimes it was just I am safe, and over time those sentences became proof that I was building something strong, something quiet, something lasting. And I told myself that if I ever felt the urge to reach out to them, to explain, to justify, to revisit, I would read those pages and remind myself of the cost of returning to people who only knew how to love me when I was useful and the cost was too high, and I spent my days building a life I did not have to escape from, and I spent my nights resting in a body that no longer flinched at shadows, and I kept that promise to myself every single day because I had learned that peace was not something you stumbled into, it was something you chose every time you decided not to betray yourself again. It was a bright morning in late spring when I realized I had not thought about them in almost a week, and that realization landed with more weight than I expected, not because I missed them, but because I did not, and that absence of longing was new and strong and real, and I stood by the window of my apartment with a coffee in hand and let the sunlight pour over me as if it were proof that life could rebuild itself without needing to go back to gather what had been broken. And I thought about how far I had come from the version of myself that flinched at every buzz on my phone and felt obligated to answer every cry for help, and I remembered how many times I had called that help love, and how many years I had wasted trying to earn approval that would only ever be given when I was useful, and now here I was with no messages from Diane or Franklin or Haley, and no anxiety waiting to explode in my chest, and for the first time since I bought that one-way ticket I felt like I had finally stepped into the life I was always meant to live, and I walked to the lab that day with a lightness in my steps that I could feel in my spine. And when I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, I saw a note from my supervisor thanking me for a research lead I had developed, and it was not grand or dramatic, just a few simple words, but they were enough to remind me that this life, the one I had now, was built on truth and effort and mutual respect, not manipulation or guilt. And later that afternoon, I was walking to grab lunch when I passed a woman on the street crying into her phone, and she was saying things I had said 100 times. I gave them everything, and it still was not enough, and I paused just for a second as that sentence echoed in me like a familiar song, and then I kept walking because I knew that place, and I knew how hard it was to leave, and I knew that she would have to find her own way out just like I did, and I hoped silently that she would. And that night I pulled out my journal, and instead of one sentence I wrote 3, I am free, I am whole, I am done, and I closed the book and felt something final settle in my bones. And a few days later, a friend from work invited me to a small gathering at her place, and I went not because I felt pressured, but because I wanted to, and I stood in a room with people who asked about my favorite books and laughed at my terrible jokes, and never once asked about my family, and that was a gift. And while I was there I met someone, his name was Elias, and he had kind eyes and an easy way of listening that made you feel like your words had weight. And we talked about music and cities and the small things that make people stay or leave, and I told him about Toronto and how it was the first place I ever chose entirely on my own. And he said he could see it in the way I stood like someone who had fought hard to take up space and was not planning to give it back. And I did not tell him everything, not then, not yet, because the story of what I had escaped was still sacred and still healing, and I wanted to protect it like a wound that had not scarred over completely. And he understood that without me saying it, and we exchanged numbers and began to talk slowly, no pressure, no performance, just connection built brick by brick. And I learned that love does not have to arrive with fanfare or tests. Sometimes it comes in the form of someone remembering how you take your tea, or someone walking you home because it is raining and they do not want you to get wet, and the gentleness of it undid something in me, something that had been braced for impact for so long that I forgot what softness felt like, and I let myself feel it, even though it scared me, and I told myself that fear was normal, that fear was just the echo of old pain trying to find its place in a new story, and I did not push it away. I let it sit beside me and speak until it quieted on its own. And around that time I received one last piece of mail forwarded from my old address, and it was a letter from a credit bureau confirming that all shared accounts had been officially dissolved and removed from my record. And I read it 3 times, not because I did not believe it, but because I needed to feel the finality. And when I put the letter down, I stood in my kitchen and said out loud to no one, "They cannot touch me anymore." And that sentence hung in the air like a benediction, and I whispered it again and again until I believed it with my whole chest. And the next day I Went to the bookstore and bought myself a hardbound journal, the expensive kind I used to think I did not deserve, and I wrote my name on the first page in black ink, and beneath it, I wrote, "This story belongs to me," and every night I filled its pages not with the past, but with the present, and dreamed for the future places I wanted to travel, foods I wanted to try, names I wanted to give my future dog, colors I wanted to paint my walls. And in those small declarations I found joy that was not borrowed or conditional. And a few weeks later I went to the art gallery again, not with new work, but just visit, and the owner smiled when he saw me and said people still stopped to look at my piece, and he asked if I wanted to submit more, and I said yes, and felt the courage in that answer, because for so long I had only said yes when it meant giving something up, and now I was saying yes to myself. And next time I talked to Morgan, I told her about the gallery and the journal and the person I was becoming, and she told me she had no doubt that I would make something beautiful out of all of this, and I believed her because I was already doing it, and I did not need my past to be erased or rewritten. I just needed it to stop being the thing that defined me, and I had finally reached that place where it was just part of the story, not the whole thing, and I kept seeing Elias, and our connection grew. And when I told him more about my family, he listened not with pity, but with respect, and he did not try to fix it or explain it away. He just sat beside me and held space for the truth, and that was more healing than any apology I never got. And I realized then that I had not just escaped a toxic system, I had built a new one where kindness did not come with strings, and where love did not mean losing myself. And as the days turned into months, I stopped measuring time by what I had lost and started measuring it by what I had gained, and every morning I woke up in a space that I chose, surrounded by things that made me feel alive, and I stopped checking my phone out of fear and started answering calls with curiosity, and I no longer dreaded mail or notifications or the quiet of my own company. Because I had become someone, I was proud to be someone who chose herself and never looked back. The day I finally understood what it meant to feel safe in my own skin was not marked by any grand event or sudden revelation, but by a simple afternoon where I sat alone on my balcony with the sun warming my shoulders, and realized I no longer felt the pull of old roles trying to reclaim me, and thoughts of what Diane might be doing, or whether Franklin was still nursing his pride, or if Haley had found someone else to absorb the cost of her chaos, did not weigh me down the way they used to, and they passed through my mind like background noise and not like anchors, and I smiled because that silence inside me was hard-earned, and I had fought for it tooth and nail and choice by choice, and it reminded me of Morgan's report, the one that had opened my eyes and shown me the blueprint of a life that had never been mine. And I thought back to that moment at my desk in Nashville when I had scrolled through her day, and watching the dots connect the numbers tell a truth that had lived in shadows, and I remembered how my heart had pounded not with fear, but with awakening, and how the weight of that report was not in what it said, but in what it revealed, and that memory hit me now not as trauma but as gratitude, because without it I might still be caught in the cycle of giving and shrinking and apologizing for wanting a life that belonged only to me. And it was strange how something as sterile as numbers could carry the weight of revelation, but they had, because numbers do not lie. And in those spreadsheets and summaries I had seen years of being used disguised as tradition, and I had finally called it what it was, and naming something is the first step to breaking it. And I had not only broken the cycle, I had walked away from the rubble and built something new and solid and real. And every time I looked around my apartment, or caught my reflection in the mirror, or listened to my own voice speak without trembling, I knew I had done the right thing, and that knowing had become the foundation for every new step I took. And sometimes people asked about my family, and I would pause and smile and say we are not close, and they would nod and move on. And that was enough, because I had learned that not every story needed to be explained, and not every wound needed to be displayed, and I was allowed to keep my peace as private as I wanted. And around that time I started helping a colleague at the lab named Rena, who reminded me a little of myself in the early years, sharp and kind, and always bracing for the next unfair request. And one day she confided that her older brother had asked her for money again after years of silence, and that her parents were urging her to say yes. And she looked at me with eyes full of conflict and fear, and said, "I do not want to be selfish," and I felt something in me rise, not anger but protection. And I told her gently that protecting your future is not selfish, and giving until you are empty is not love, and her eyes welled up, and she whispered, "Thank you," like no one had ever said that to her before, and maybe they had not, and maybe like me, she had been raised in a structure that taught her being generous meant being silent. And I walked away from that conversation knowing that the freedom I had claimed was not just mine to keep, something I could pass forward in small moments of truth and care, and that felt powerful because it meant that even the most painful parts of my story could be repurposed into light. And around that time, Elias and I had our first real disagreement, and it was not loud or cruel, it was just honest and uncomfortable, and when I walked into the room to talk it through, I felt that old instinct to bend to agree quickly to keep the peace at any cost, and I paused and reminded myself that this was not the past, and he was not them, and I did not have to disappear to be loved. And when I spoke, I kept my voice steady and told the truth even though it was vulnerable, and his response was not anger or disappointment, but patience and openness, and I realized that this was what it meant to be in something healthy, something rooted in choice and not obligation, and we worked through it and came out strong. Not because we avoided conflict, but because we respected each other enough to navigate it without turning it into a power play. And that night I cried not from sadness, but from relief, because I had never known what it felt like to be met with grace instead of guilt, and I promised myself again that I would never return to a world where love meant losing pieces of myself. And the next morning I woke up and made a list of goals, not the kind you make to impress people or prove a point, but the kind that come from the heart, like write more poems and learn to cook something new every week and take a solo trip to the coast. And I pinned that list on the fridge where I could see it every day, and each item was a reminder that I was not just surviving, I was living and dreaming and planning. And all of it was mine. And one evening I got a message from someone I had not spoken to in years, a friend from high school who had once seen how much I carried but never knew how to ask if I was okay. And she said, "I saw what happened with your family, and I just wanted you to know. I always admired your strength, and I never forgot how kind you were to me when I was struggling." And I sat with that message for a long time and realized that even when I had been in survival mode, I had managed to be good and generous and whole in ways I never gave myself credit for, and that made me weep because I had spent so long believing I was only valuable when I was saving other people. And now I knew that my value had always been intrinsic and eternal and untouched by their neglect. And I replied and thanked her, and we made plans to meet for coffee and reconnect. And that small reconnection reminded me that not all ties to the past are weights, some are roots, and when nurtured they can grow into something new, healthy. And life kept moving, and I kept moving with it, not ahead of it, not behind it, but with it. And I learned to dance in my apartment when I felt overwhelmed, and to forgive myself when the sadness returned, and to pause and breathe when my chest tightened with memories. And I no longer rushed to escape my emotions because they no longer terrified me, and I no longer feared the quiet because the quiet was mine, and it had become a friend and not a punishment. And I looked around at my life and saw not escape but arrival, not rejection but reclamation, and I whispered thank you to the version of me who had dared to say no and buy that one-way ticket, because she had changed the course of my entire life, and I was proud of her, and I would never stop being proud. There was a quiet confidence that started growing in me like a slow-blooming tree, and it did not come from sudden victories or grand gestures, but from small, consistent choices made in solitude without applause. And one of those choices was deciding to no longer chase closure from people who refused to take accountability. And it was one of the hardest lessons I had learned, because for so long I had believed that healing required understanding, and that I needed them to admit the harm they had caused to finally be free from it. But I had come to see that waiting for people like Franklin and Diane to take responsibility was just another way of handing them control, and I had spent enough of my life making space for their narratives while mine went ignored. And so I stopped wishing for an apology and started giving myself the validation they never would, and that shift changed everything, because It gave me the freedom to feel joy without guilt and success without shame and peace without explanation, and I found that my days became lighter not because the past disappeared, but because it no longer dictated the shape of my future, and I could feel that clarity every time I walked through my apartment, every time I answered a call without dread, every time I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had made the hardest decision of her life and refused to turn back, and the beauty of that decision began to show up in unexpected ways, like the way I handled conflict at work with firmness and grace, or the way I supported friends without losing myself in their chaos, or the way I stood up for my boundaries even when no one else understood them. And one afternoon, I received an email from a publishing company that had seen one of my art pieces through the gallery, and they asked if I would be interested in illustrating a short story collection, and I stared at that email for several minutes before replying, because the version of me from just a year ago would have doubted whether she deserved that opportunity, would have hesitated out of fear that she was not good enough or experienced enough, but this version of me said yes without apology, and that yes led to a contract and a timeline and a new routine that made me feel more alive than I had in years. And I worked late into the nights sketching and editing and creating, and every time I put pencil to paper, I poured into it all emotion I had once been told to suppress, and I let the lines carry my truth, and the colors carry my rage, and the textures carry my release. And when the book was finally published, and my name was printed in bold on the back cover, I held it in my hands and wept, not for the girl who had been hurt, for the woman who had survived. And in that moment I realized that survival is not just about escaping the fire. It is about rebuilding after the smoke clears and finding beauty in the ash. And I shared the news with Elias and with Rena, and with the small circle of people who had become my chosen family, and their joy for me was untainted by jealousy or expectation. And it was the kind of support I had always craved and never received from the people who were supposed to love me first. And one evening, while celebrating the book release with friends, I received a message from an unknown number, and I opened it cautiously and saw a short paragraph from Diane. She wrote, "I heard about your book. I always knew you were talented, and I hope you know that no matter what, you are still part of this family." And I sat there staring at those words, feeling nothing at first, and then something sharp and cold crept in, because that message was not an apology. It was a reach, a soft attempt to reinsert herself into my life without ever addressing the damage done, and I could see through it immediately the way she wrapped entitlement in sentiment and offered recognition as if it was a favor, and I did not reply because I had promised myself that I would not go back to places where I had to shrink to be loved. And that message reminded me that they still did not understand that being family is not about blood, it is about behavior, and their behavior had cost them the right to witness the life I had built. And I turned off my phone and rejoined the celebration, and when someone raised a toast to the future, I smiled and meant it with every fiber of my being, because my future was finally mine and mine alone. And days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and the book sold well, and I began receiving letters from readers who saw themselves in my work and thanked me for giving their pain a shape and a name. And I kept every one of those letters in a box by my bed, and on days when the old voices returned whispering that I had been too harsh or too selfish, I opened that box and read those letters aloud until the whispers disappeared. And I reminded myself that the most radical thing I had ever done was choose myself over a legacy of silence and sacrifice. And I continued to grow in ways that surprised even me. I started running not to lose weight or prove something, but because the rhythm of my feet on the pavement made me feel grounded. And I started cooking elaborate meals just because I could, and I started painting on bigger canvases because I no longer cared about taking up space. And I started laughing louder because I was no longer afraid of being too much, and all of it came together like pieces of a puzzle that had waited patiently for me to stop handing them away. And every so often I would think about Haley and wonder if she had changed, if she had faced herself and done the work, or if she was still looking for someone else to carry her. And I hoped for her sake that she had grown, but I also knew that her growth was not my responsibility, and that I could care without carrying, and that distinction was another form of healing. And around the anniversary of my move to Toronto, I took a trip to the coast alone, and I stood on the edge of the ocean with the wind in my hair and the waves crashing at my feet, and I thought about that younger version of me, the one who bought that plane ticket in a rush and packed her bags through tears and shut her phone off while her family imploded in her inbox, and I wanted to tell her how proud I was, how brave she had been, how much she had given me by refusing to disappear, and I whispered thank you into the wind and let the ocean carry it. And when I returned home, I hung a new painting on my wall, one that I had created during the trip, and in the corner, I signed it not with my full name, but with a small symbol I had created just for myself, because some things are not meant for anyone else. And I looked around my apartment and felt the stillness again, the sacred kind, the kind that holds you instead of haunting you, and I realized that I was no longer surviving, I was living, and not just living, I was thriving, and it was all because I had said no once and meant it forever. The morning I received the letter from Franklin was colder than usual for spring, and the wind coming through my window carried a sharp edge that made me wrap my sweater tighter around my shoulders as I picked up the envelope from the mailbox and saw his name printed neatly in the return corner. For a moment I stood frozen at the door, the weight of old memories pressing against my chest like a wave I did not want to let in. But I stepped inside and placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea before opening it, because I wanted to remind myself that I had control now, that I did not owe my past any urgency. And when I finally slit the envelope open with calm, deliberate hands, I pulled out a folded sheet of paper and unfolded it to read a message that was exactly what I had expected, and yet still somehow managed to sting, because it was a letter filled with the kind of language that danced around the truth, carefully crafted to sound like wisdom, but dripping with disappointment and manipulation. And he wrote about legacy and pride, and how families weather storms together, and how he had always done what he thought was best for his children, even if it was not always easy to understand. And he wrote about Haley and how she was struggling, and how she had made mistakes, but she was still family. And he wrote about forgiveness and tradition, and about how doors should never be permanently closed because blood is thicker than history. And then at the very end he wrote the words I knew were coming but dreaded anyway. He said, I hope you find your way back home someday, because this family is not complete without you. And I sat down at the table with that letter in my hands and stared at it until my tea grew cold, because those words carried all the weight of a command disguised as an invitation, and I could see so clearly now how this had always been the pattern, and how every time I tried to step away, they wrapped their expectations in sentiment, and called it love, and how I had once been fooled by it so many times, but not anymore, because I had learned that words without accountability are just noise, and that guilt dressed up as kindness is still control. And I folded the letter slowly and placed it back into the envelope and slid it into the drawer beneath my sink, where I kept old batteries and receipts and things I never planned to look at again. And I did not cry, and I did not rage, because the truth no longer hurt, it just clarified, and it reminded me why I had walked away and why I would not return. And later that evening I told Elias about the letter, and he listened quietly without trying to fix anything. And when I finished, he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine and said, you did the bravest thing, and you do not owe anyone a return. And I felt that truth settle in me like a stone, strong and unmoving. And I realized that I was no longer afraid of what they thought of me, because I had finally become someone I respected, and that was more important than their approval. And the next morning I went for a long walk and ended up in a part of the city I had not explored before, and I found a small antique shop tucked between a bakery and a florist, and inside I found a vintage mirror with a gold frame slightly cracked at the corner, and something about it felt honest and beautiful, and I bought it and hung it in my entryway. And every time I passed it I looked into it and reminded myself that imperfection is not failure, and that cracks are just proof that something has survived. And one afternoon I received an email from a student who had read the illustrated book I worked on, and she told me that my art had helped her put words to feelings she had buried for years, and she thanked me for being brave, and I replied to tell her that she was brave too for facing them, and her response was a single sentence. That made me pause. She said I did not know people could choose peace, and that hit me harder than I expected, because I remembered when I did not know that either, and I remembered when I thought love meant sacrifice and family, meant silence and success, meant being small enough not to threaten anyone else, and I remembered the years I spent contorting myself into shapes that made everyone else comfortable, and how I had convinced myself that martyrdom was noble, but I had learned that there is no glory in disappearing for others, and that love built on conditions is not love at all, and I wrote that down in my journal and underlined it twice, and I kept painting and kept writing, and I started volunteering once a week at a community center, helping young women learn to express themselves through art, and every session reminded me of the power of creation, the way stories can become bridges, and colors can become healing, and truth can become freedom. And one of the girls asked me once, how do you know when it is time to walk away? And I told her, you know when staying starts to feel like betrayal. And she nodded slowly, like something in her had been waiting to hear that, and I wondered how many people were still trapped in roles that suffocated them because they had been taught that love was supposed to hurt, and I made it my mission to remind them that it is not. And one evening Elias and I were walking through the park when he asked me what would you do if they ever truly apologized, and I thought about it for a long moment before answering, and then I said I would listen but I would not return, and he nodded and said that sounds right, and that conversation lingered with me because it reminded me that forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation, and that you can release the anger without reopening the door, and I had forgiven them not because they asked or deserved it, but because I deserved peace, and carrying that weight was not mine anymore, and I was not interested in rebuilding what had always been broken, and I had created something stronger, something honest, and I was not going to trade it for a seat at a table where I had to starve for love. And that night I lit a candle and wrote a letter, not to send but to say everything I had never been allowed to speak, and in that letter I told them that I loved them, but I loved myself more, and that I hoped they found healing. But I could not be the one to give it to them, and I signed it with my full name and the date, and folded it into my journal, and the act of writing it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for decades, and I slept better that night than I had in years, and when I woke up the world felt lighter, and I knew I had closed another door inside me and sealed it with grace. The seasons shifted, and with them so did I. No longer the woman who had once stood silent at a dinner table as her life was shredded by the people she called family. Now I moved through my days with deliberate calm and a steady sense of self I never had before, and while some memories still pressed against the edges of my peace, I had built enough strength to hold them without drowning in them. Elias and I had settled into our routine, a rhythm that was neither dramatic nor loud, but deeply comforting. He never asked more than I could give, and never gave less than what was needed, and one evening, as we shared a quiet meal in our small kitchen, he asked if I had ever considered telling my story in a more public way, and at first I hesitated, unsure if the wounds I had finally stitched up were ready to be reopened for others to see, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence had never protected me, and maybe someone else out there needed to hear what survival looked like when it was not clean or pretty or poetic. And so I started writing, not for validation or vengeance, but for clarity, and for the chance to put into words what had once lived only as pain in my body. I wrote about the savings, the betrayal, the demand for $150,000 that came not as a request, but as an entitlement. I wrote about my sister's voice, sharp and confident, as if she had earned what I had worked for, as if family loyalty meant I had to hand over my future to save her mistakes. I wrote about my parents who stood behind her like a wall, making me feel like an intruder in my own story. And I wrote about the moment I said no, and the quiet that followed it, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that signals a storm. And I wrote about my decision to leave, to choose myself, not as an act of selfishness, but as a final declaration that I was no longer willing to bleed so others could feel warm. And as the words poured out of me, I felt something uncoil inside, a release that was subtle but certain. And when I was done with the first draft, I let Elias read it, and he sat in silence after finishing, then looked at me and said, "This is not just your story, it is a map for others," and I decided to submit it anonymously to a small publication that focused on personal essays, and a few weeks later they reached out saying they wanted to publish it and asked if I would consider attaching my name, and after a long night of staring at the ceiling, I wrote back and said yes because I was no longer hiding, and when the story went live, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages poured in from people across the country, women, men, siblings, parents, strangers, saw themselves in my words and thanked me for putting into light what they had lived in shadow. And one message stood out, a woman who wrote, "I thought I was alone until I read your story, and now I know I am not." And that sentence stayed with me more than any other because I had once felt the same, and I understood how powerful connection could be when rooted in truth and not expectation, and my story being out in the world did not change the past, but it changed how I carried it, and it changed how others saw theirs. And then one afternoon, I received a message from an old high school classmate, someone who had known both me and Haley, and she wrote that she had read the piece and recognized the story even without the names, and she wanted me to know that she had always admired me even back then, even when I had been quiet and polite and invisible, and she said that seeing me now made her believe that maybe she too could reclaim her voice, and I replied with warmth and encouragement, and for the first time in a long time I felt like the chapters of my life were connecting not in a straight line, but in a meaningful one, and I started to think about writing more, not just about my past, but about the ways we rebuild, the small victories, the quiet wins, the moments when choosing peace is an act of rebellion. And I began outlining a book, not a memoir exactly, but a series of reflections and lessons built from experience and scar tissue and healing, and Elias supported me through every draft, offering gentle feedback and strong tea, and reminding me that truth is enough. And in between writing, I continued teaching art classes and mentoring and painting, not for galleries, but for myself, and one day, I painted a piece that made me pause when I stepped back to look at it. It was abstract, but something in the shapes and colors felt like release, like a door opening to a place I had not known existed, and I hung it in our hallway, and every time I walked by it, I felt stronger and more rooted. And one morning as I was leaving the house, my phone buzzed, and it was an email from a woman named Rachel, an editor from a well-known publishing house who had read my essay and wanted to talk about a possible book deal, and I stared at the screen for a full minute before calling Elias and reading the email out loud, and he just said, "I am so proud of you," and I took a deep breath and replied to Rachel, and we set up a call, and that call turned into a contract, and the contract turned into a book, and the book turned into another door opening, one I never thought I would walk through. And I did not write to be famous or wealthy, I wrote to be free, and that freedom found its way to others, and the more I shared, the more I healed. And one afternoon, while visiting a bookshop for a small reading, I was approached by a woman in her 60s who had tears in her eyes, and she told me that she had finally told her husband no for the first time in 30 years because of my words, and I hugged her. And we cried together, and I realized that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply speak. And while I knew I would never have the family I once dreamed of, I had something better. I had a life built on honesty and courage and love that did not demand I shrink, and the further I moved from people who tried to shape me, the clearer I became, and the world no longer felt like something I had to survive. It felt like something I was allowed to live. And I knew there would always be moments when old wounds ached and old memories crept in, but I also knew that I had built enough light around me to keep the darkness from taking root again, and that was enough. After the book was released, the days seemed to stretch out differently, each one filled with something new and quietly significant, and I found myself waking up without the heaviness that used to sit on my chest before my feet even touched the floor. I was receiving invitations to speak at community centers, libraries, and support groups, places where people needed to hear that saying no was not betrayal, and that choosing your peace was not a weakness but a victory. And I would stand in front of rooms full of strangers and tell my truth without the shame that used to wrap itself around my voice. and I noticed that in every room at least one person would cry, not because my story was so unique, but because it was so familiar, and the power in that sameness was something I had never fully understood until those moments when someone would come up afterward and say I thought I was the only one. And over time, those stories collected in my heart like patches in a quilt, each one a different shape and color, but all sewn together by the thread of survival. And it was during one of those talks at a small community library that a woman approached me afterward, her eyes wide with disbelief, and she said, "You are Jenna, right? Jenna Carver." And when I nodded, she looked away for a moment, then said, "I used to work with your sister Haley a long time ago." And for a split second my breath caught in my throat, and all those old reflexes kicked in my body, tensed, my fingers curled into fists at my sides. The woman continued, "I just wanted you to know that she used to talk about you all the time, and not always kindly, but always with this weird kind of jealousy, and I remember thinking even back then that she was trying to be someone she wasn't, and it's strange to hear your side of things now, but it makes sense, and I just want to say I'm glad you told it." And she walked away after that, but her words stuck with me, not because I needed validation, but because it confirmed something I had always suspected, but never heard out loud, that even when Haley tried to tear me down, there was something in her that recognized what I had, and that maybe that recognition scared her. And one evening, after another long day, I sat on the porch with Elias sipping tea, watching the sun dip below the trees, and he asked me, "Do you ever think about going back?" And I knew what he meant, not going back to live, but just to see. And I nodded slowly, because the truth was I had thought about it, and maybe some part of me needed to see that old place one last time, to stand on that soil and not feel small anymore. And so we planned a short trip, nothing dramatic, just a few days, and when we arrived back in the town I had left behind, everything looked smaller: the streets, the houses, the school, the coffee shop where I used to write in a corner booth, and most of all my parents' house, the one I had once called home. And I stood across the street from it for a long time, just looking, not moving, not speaking. And I did not need go in, I did not need to knock, I just needed to see it and then walk away, and I did, and it felt like closing a book you had outgrown, one that taught you important lessons but no longer belonged on your shelf. And we drove around the town, visited my old high school, peeked into the art room where my love for creating had first bloomed, and then we left, and I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I had finally untied the last knot holding me to a past I no longer needed to carry. And on our way back to the city, Elias reached over, took my hand, and said, "I am proud of you, not just for surviving, for transforming." And I smiled, because I knew I had done exactly that. And in the weeks that followed, the book continued to grow, gaining readers and quietly finding its way into circles I never imagined. And one afternoon I received a message through my website from a woman named Caroline, who ran a small nonprofit that helped women recover from financial abuse, and she asked if I would consider partnering with them to create a series of workshops based on my book and my experiences. And without hesitation, I said yes, and what began as a few sessions turned into a full program, and those workshops became one of the most fulfilling things I had ever done, because in those rooms we talked about money and guilt and self-worth and boundaries and choices, and I saw women who had been told they were selfish or dramatic or ungrateful stand up straighter, speak louder, and begin to believe they deserved more. And it reminded me of who I used to be and who I had become. And in one of those workshops, a young woman, maybe 22 or 23, stood up and said, "My sister always told me that if I didn't help her, I was a bad person, but reading your book made me realize that her choices are not my responsibility." And the room clapped for her, and I did too, because it was a truth that had taken me nearly 30 years to understand, and she had claimed it so much earlier, and it gave me hope. And in between all this, life kept happening, quiet and simple and steady. Elias and I adopted a rescue dog named Willow, who followed me around the house like a shadow and curled at my feet when I wrote, and barked furiously at the vacuum, and wagged her tail so hard her whole body moved. And our home felt full, not in the noisy, chaotic way of my childhood, but in a way that meant something. Every piece of furniture, every book, every cup had been chosen with care, and it felt like mine in the truest sense. And one evening I received a letter in the mail, no return address, and I opened it cautiously, and inside was a short note written in tight, sharp handwriting. and it said, "I hope you're happy now," and that was it. No name, no signature, but I knew it was from Haley, and for a moment I just stared at it, unsure what I felt: anger, sadness, pity. But in the end I folded it back up, placed it in a drawer, and walked away because I was happy, and I would not let her bitterness infect what I had built. And I never received another letter from her again, and that was fine because I no longer needed her to understand me or love me or even acknowledge me. I had stopped needing that a long time ago, and as the months passed, I finished another book, this one more focused on healing, on the process of becoming, on quiet parts of recovery that no one sees, and I wrote it slower, more thoughtfully. And when it was done, I knew it was something special, not just because of the words, but because of the way I had changed while writing them. And my publisher loved it, and it was scheduled for release the following spring. And I planned a small tour, nothing flashy, just enough to connect with people and share space and stories. And somewhere in all of this I realized that I had not just escaped my past, I had rewritten my future. And it no longer revolved around survival, but around creation and contribution and peace. And one night, as Elias and I sat watching the stars, he said, "Do you realize how far you have come?" And I laughed and said, "Not really." And he squeezed my hand and said, "I do." And I looked up at the sky and thought about the version of me that once stood in a living room being told to hand over $150,000, and how that girl felt backed into a corner, voiceless, afraid, obligated, and how that girl became this woman who now helps others find their voice and their freedom. And I whispered, "Thank you to the stars, not to any god or person, just to the journey itself and all it had taught me," because even though it had hurt, it had also shaped me into someone I was finally proud to be. The morning of the second book's release arrived quietly, without ceremony, just the soft sound of Willow's paws on the floor and the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, and I sat at the table watching the light creep across the hardwood, as if it too was hesitant to break the calm that had settled into my life. And Elias kissed the top of my head, placed the steaming mug beside me, and said, "You did it again." And I smiled because this time I felt it, not the nerves, not the fear, but a full peace, like everything in me knew I had walked through the fire and built something from the ashes. And as the messages began to come in, emails, texts, comments from early readers and old friends, there was a thread that connected all of them, a deep appreciation not just for the story, but for the honesty, the rawness, the way I had laid out my life, not as a tragedy but as a journey. And that day I went for a long walk alone, taking the path by the lake that curved through the trees and opened into that clearing where the water shimmered and the wind made the leaves sing. And I stood there thinking about every step it took to get here, how each moment of loss, each confrontation, each tear that fell in silence had brought me forward. And I thought about my sister, not with hatred, not even with sadness, but with acceptance, and I realized I had truly let go. And that kind of freedom is different from escape, because it does not come from running. It comes from understanding and forgiving and choosing differently. And somewhere along that walk, I decided that the next chapter of my life would be about creating, not just writing, but shaping spaces where others could breathe again, just like I had. And that thought filled me with something close to joy. And not long after, I was invited to speak at a conference for women in finance and empowerment, and the organizers wanted me to open the event, to tell my story and set the tone for everything that followed. And as I stood on that stage, looking out at the sea of faces, each one carrying their own silent battles, I felt no fear, only clarity. And I told them how it began with $150,000 and a sister who believed she had the right to it. And I spoke about the guilt, the manipulation, the isolation, and then the choice, the refusal, the suitcase, the one-way ticket, and how that one decision to say no had split my life into two, before and after. And I told them that yes, it was terrifying, and yes, I questioned myself every step of the way, but that no one was coming to save me, and I had to choose to save myself. And when I finished, the room was silent for a moment, then thunderous, and women stood with tears in their eyes, some clapping, some nodding, all of them feeling something. And later, during the break, a woman came up to me and said, "I have never said no to anyone in my family, and tomorrow I will." And I hugged her and whispered, "You are allowed." And I knew it would echo in her for a long time, because those words had once echoed in me, and from that conference came more opportunities, interviews, panels, podcasts, and through it all I kept my focus not on fame or attention, but on truth, and every time someone said your story helped me, I felt a little more healed. And one evening I received a call from a journalist doing a feature on financial abuse in families, and she said, "We want to highlight real stories, not just statistics, and yours is one of the most powerful I have heard." And I agreed to the interview, because if my pain could help someone else avoid theirs, then it was worth it. And the article was published in a national magazine with a photo of me standing by the lake looking peaceful, strong, and underneath it the headline read, "She said no and changed her life." And I cried when I saw it, not because I was sad, but because I never thought I would be seen this way. And the responses were overwhelming. People reached out from across the country, some from other countries, all saying thank you. And the thing I noticed most was how many said I thought I was alone. And I realized how deeply isolation fed abuse, how silence protected those who caused harm, and how telling the truth broke that silence wide open. And in the months that followed, I started working on a foundation, a space, both physical and digital, where people could come for resources, support, community. And I called it the turning point because that was what saying no had been for me, a turning point, not an end, but a beginning. And we offered financial literacy workshops, therapy, scholarships, legal consultations. And slowly it grew, and I hired a team, people who understood not just the logistics, but the heart of what we were doing. And every week I heard new stories, and I carried them all carefully like small lights. And I never forgot what it felt like to be in the dark. And during all this, life kept going in its soft, beautiful rhythm, Elias. And I planted a garden, filled it with herbs and flowers and vegetables. And on Sundays we made big breakfasts and sat on the porch with Willow stretched out between us. And sometimes I would look at him and think how lucky I was, not in the blind chance way, but in the I fought for this way. And one morning I received an email with a familiar last name, and my heart skipped because it was from a cousin I had not spoken to in years. And she said, "I read your book and I believe you, and I want you to know that not everyone in the family sees you as the villain." And I sat with that message for a long time, and then replied, "Thank you, I no longer need to be understood, but I appreciate being seen." And that was enough. And slowly even other distant relatives reached out, some with apologies, some just wanting to reconnect. And I did not open every door, but I left a few cracked just enough to let the good in. And that became my new rule: only let in what makes you feel safe and strong. And one night, years later, I stood in the back of a bookstore watching a young woman sign copies of her first book. And she had once sat in my workshop, trembling, unsure, afraid to use her voice. And now here she was, laughing, confident, proud. And I realized this was the full circle, not just surviving, not just healing, but creating and lifting. And I felt tears in my eyes because this was what legacy meant. And I turned to Elias, who stood beside me always, and said this was worth everything. And he nodded and said yes, every single part. And as we left the bookstore, walking into the soft night air, I looked up at the stars and whispered thank you again, not for the pain, but for the transformation, for the way life had not broken me but reshaped me. And in the distance I could hear laughter, music, the hum of a world moving forward, and I walked into it unafraid, finally whole. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.